Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
Valhari Station smelled like recycled air and ambition, which Elliot Ward had come to understand were essentially the same thing. The station hung in the upper atmosphere of a gas giant the color of an old bruise, its orbital rings rotating at the kind of unhurried pace that suggested whoever designed them had wanted visitors to feel contemplative rather than nauseous, a goal it achieved for approximately 60% of species and catastrophically failed for the remaining 40. Elliot was in the 60%, which he considered one of the few unambiguous wins of his career. He had arrived 2 days ago aboard a transit shuttle from the Helix hub, carrying one suitcase, one portable excavation scanner he had not been asked to bring but brought anyway out of professional habit, and one presentation he had rehearsed 11 times on the journey and which had been received this morning by an audience of 12 people in conference room 7C, a room designed to seat 80. 3 of the 12 had been asleep. One had been a sanitation drone that wandered in through a side access panel sometime around slide 4 and had remained motionless and attentive in the back row until the end, which Elliot had found oddly encouraging. He was, by most reasonable assessments, a competent archaeologist. He worked for the University of New Edinburgh's Department of Exohistorical Material Culture, which was a title that had sounded impressive when he accepted the position 7 years ago, and had since revealed itself to mean that he spent a significant portion of his professional life in holes, brushing sand off things with a tool that looked like a toothbrush because, structurally, it essentially was. He had excavated sites on 4 planets. He had published 16 papers, 3 of which had been cited by researchers he respected, and one of which had been cited by a popular science publication in a way that technically got the findings correct, but used the headline, "Archaeologist Unearths Ancient Alien Toilet," in reference to what Elliot maintained firmly had been a ritual ablution vessel. The distinction mattered. He had written a letter. They had not published it. The networking reception was held on the atrium level, a vast open space where the station's exterior viewport panels had been dimmed to a blue-gray that fell somewhere between twilight and the inside of a very expensive waiting room. Along the curved walls, suspended in illuminated cylindrical tanks, clusters of bioluminescent organisms drifted in slow, indifferent orbits. Elliot had been told they were decorative. He had also been told, later, by a Venari delegate he'd spoken to briefly near the catering station, that they were considered sacred navigational symbols in 3 separate stellar cultures, and that displaying them in a conference atrium was either a bold gesture of intercultural celebration or a moderate diplomatic incident, depending on who you asked. Elliot had looked at them floating peacefully in their tanks and thought that they, at least, seemed unbothered. He was on his second glass of something pale and faintly effervescent that the menu had described as harmonically balanced for multi-species palates, which in practice meant it tasted aggressively of nothing, when his colleague Priya Vasquez appeared at his elbow with the expression she wore when she was about to do something for his benefit that he hadn't requested. "There's someone you should meet," she said, in the tone of someone who had already decided this was happening. "I've met people," Elliot said. "Sale Orvain," Priya said, as if he hadn't spoken. He had, in fact, read everything Sale Orvain had ever published. Her 3 volumes on pre-collapse civilizations occupied a shelf in his office that he kept clear of the general entropy that governed the rest of the room. She argued, with the kind of precise and patient intelligence that made you feel slightly ashamed of your own thinking, that the great civilizational disappearances of the ancient galactic record were not collapses but choices. He found her methodology meticulous and her conclusions quietly radical, and he had, on one occasion, recommended her 2nd volume to a graduate student with more enthusiasm than was probably professionally measured. He followed Priya across the atrium. Sale Orvain was standing near one of the far pillars, holding a glass she was not drinking from, engaged in the specific variety of conference stillness that belongs to someone who is very good at appearing present while processing several things simultaneously. She was tall and looked at first and second glance almost entirely human, the almost doing significant work. Her skin held something beneath it, a faint luminescence that pulsed in long, slow intervals, currently a calm and even blue, the way deep water looks when nothing is moving it. She had the kind of composure that was clearly constructed, not born, the composure of someone who had spent years learning exactly how much stillness other species find trustworthy. She turned as they approached. She extended her hand in the practiced human gesture. She began the sentence that begins at every conference in every language with some variation of it being a pleasure, and her eyes, moving the way eyes do during a greeting, dropped briefly, naturally, to his hand as it rose to meet hers, and they found the ring and she stopped. Not paused, stopped. The blue light beneath her skin broke apart. Across her cheekbones, down the backs of her hands, gold and white fired in fractured, irregular bursts, like a signal interrupted. Her fingers had closed around his, without completing the motion. The words she had been forming dissolved before it reached her mouth. Around them, the atrium's ambient noise continued for 4 more seconds before the quality of her silence began to matter to the people nearest them, and the conversations closest to them dropped in register, and the small gravitational field of something being very wrong began to pull attention toward the two of them standing there, her hand around his, her eyes fixed on the dark band of metal on his third finger. She said, very quietly, in a voice that carried the way quiet voices do when everything else is beginning to listen, "This is impossible." Velhari Station had the particular atmosphere of a place designed by committee, every committee from every species that had ever agreed to fund it, which meant the architecture made sense from no single angle and perfect sense from all of them simultaneously. The central atrium curved upward in a way that suggested whoever drew the plans had 3 sets of eyes and considered bilateral symmetry a charming eccentricity. The gravity was consistent, at least, which was more than could be said for the catering. Elliot Ward had been on the station for 2 days and had already committed 3 cultural violations, none of them intentional. The first had been sitting in a grief chair. He had not known it was a grief chair. It had looked, to his thoroughly human eyes, like an ordinary chair, slightly elevated, positioned near a window, available. The Dravathi delegate whose grief chair it was had not said anything directly, but the quality of the silence that followed had communicated everything that needed communicating. The second violation had involved a fountain. The third he preferred not to think about. His conference presentation had gone adequately. 12 attendees, which was either modest or respectable depending on how one felt about the acoustics of room 14C, and the scheduling conflict with the keynote on quantum sediment mapping running in the main hall at the same time. 3 of his 12 had been asleep. One had been a maintenance drone that wandered in through an unlocked door and positioned itself in the back row with what Elliot had found, in a deeply irrational way, to be an encouraging stillness. He was an archaeologist. Specifically, he was the kind of archaeologist who believed the most important work happened in the quiet hours, in the methodical brushing and cataloging and cross-referencing that no one made documentary films about. He had spent 6 years on the Anatolian excavation project, 3 of which had produced nothing of significance, and 2 of which had produced findings that revised the accepted timeline of early trade routes by approximately 400 years, a revision that had generated enormous excitement in a very specific academic community, and almost no attention anywhere else. The 6th year had produced the ring. He wore it on the 3rd finger of his right hand. Dark metal, warm against his skin in a way he had long attributed to thermal conductivity, inscribed along both surfaces with characters his translation software rendered inconsistently. Sometimes sovereign, sometimes custodian, occasionally a phrase that came out as "the blood returns home," which he had always assumed was a processing error. He had submitted it for materials analysis. The lab report had come back with a classification of unidentified alloy, pre-modern, origin unclear, which was technically thorough and practically useless. He had kept it because it fit. That was the whole of it. It fit, and he had grown accustomed to the weight of it, and removing it had started to feel like removing something that belonged. The second evening's reception was held in the grand atrium, where bioluminescent organisms drifted in suspended columns of water along the walls, and the lighting was calibrated for 11 different visual spectrums simultaneously, which meant the room looked, to Elliot, like a beautiful dream experienced by someone with a much more interesting nervous system than his own. He had a glass of something described on the menu as broadly palatable, which was accurate, and was mid-conversation about stratigraphic methodology with a Venari researcher when his colleague Marcus steered him, with the gentle insistence of someone doing a favor, toward the far side of the atrium. She was standing near a pillar with the composed stillness of someone who had learned, deliberately, how to occupy a room without demanding it. She looked almost human, tall, measured in posture, with a face that belonged to someone who had spent considerable time being the most prepared person in any given space. Beneath the surface of her skin, slow and rhythmic light moved, not dramatically, not like a display, like something alive and calm, cycling in deep blue through her cheekbones and the backs of her hands. He had read her work. All 3 volumes, the footnotes especially. She extended her hand in the practiced human gesture. She began the sentence, the standard one, the "it is a pleasure" sentence that conference attendees worldwide and across species lines had worn smooth with repetition, and her eyes moved, as eyes do in the first seconds of meeting someone, and they found the ring on his right hand, and she stopped. Not paused, stopped. The blue beneath her skin broke apart into fractured gold and white, firing in short, uncontrolled bursts across her face before collapsing inward. Her fingers had closed around his without completing the handshake. Around them, conversations continued for 4 more seconds before the quality of her silence began to reach people. Then she said, very quietly, in a voice that carried with the precision of something that could not help itself, "This is impossible." The 47 hours between the reception and the moment the ring spoke were not, strictly speaking, uneventful. They were the kind of hours that feel deceptively ordinary from the outside and geologically significant from the inside, the sort of interval that a person will later identify as the last stretch of time in which their life still had its previous shape. Sale had requisitioned equipment from the station's research annex under a project title she composed with the care of someone diffusing something. Pre-collapse material culture assessment. It was accurate. It explained nothing. It prompted no follow-up questions from the annex administrator, who was a Hevrathi postdoctoral fellow with 17 active projects of his own, and the focused incuriosity of someone who had learned that other people's research was rarely as interesting as it sounded. The equipment arrived on a trolley at 7 in the morning, and Sale had arranged it with a precision that Elliot found quietly impressive and chose not to comment on, because she had the focused expression of someone who did not need to be told that their arrangement of instruments was impressive. He read, in the meantime. He had brought her second volume to the conference in the way that academics sometimes carry the work of colleagues they admire but have never met, as a kind of private acknowledgement. He read it now with different eyes, which was the only way to describe the sensation of rereading a text after the person who wrote it has told you that your finger is wearing a piece of their life's central argument. He found the footnote on page 212. He read it once. He read it again. He read it a third time, and then he placed the book face down on the table in the manner of a man who needs a moment. He did not tell her about the footnote. She was calibrating a resonance scanner with both hands and a concentration that made him feel the footnote could wait for a less cosmically loaded afternoon. What she found over those 47 hours was this: the ring was not dormant. It had never been dormant. What he had spent 3 years interpreting as ordinary thermal properties, the faint warmth, the occasional sense that the metal was somehow alert, was the ring in continuous low-level operation, broadcasting on a frequency that had no entry in any current communications registry, because it predated every current communications registry by several thousand years. It had been sending since the morning he put it on in an excavation tent in Anatolia on a Tuesday, because he had been curious about the fit. The universe, Elliot reflected, had a very particular sense of comedic timing. The response, when it came, announced itself through the ring rather than through any instrument, which Sale's equipment registered half a second later in the way that secondary confirmation registers accurately, but too late to be first. The warmth changed. It had always been ambient, background, easy to explain away. Now it pulsed, a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched nothing biological in Elliot's body and felt, in a way he could not have articulated to anyone who would take him seriously, intentional. Like something on the other end of a very long wire giving the wire a careful tug. Sale looked at her instruments. Then she looked at his hand. Then she sat down, which was notable because she had not sat down voluntarily in approximately 30 hours. The signal was encoded in a Korathi cipher. She had been developing partial translation keys for across 12 years of academic work, a project that had been described by one peer reviewer as admirably persistent, and by another as the cartography of a place no one is certain exists. She decoded it in 4 hours. Elliot made coffee during these 4 hours using the consultation room's fabricator, which was old enough to have philosophical objections to certain bean origins, and expressed these objections through the medium of temperature inconsistency. The coffee was poor. They drank it anyway, because they were the kind of people who drank what was available while doing work that mattered, and because the alternative was thinking too directly about what the instruments were showing. The message resolved in 2 parts. The first was a set of coordinates, not the navigational format used by any contemporary transit system, but fold coordinates, the spatial shorthand of civilizations that had stopped thinking of distance as a fixed property and started thinking of it as a variable one. Elliot looked at them and understood, in the way that a person understands things that fall entirely outside their expertise, that they described a location that had been waiting a very long time to be found. The second part was a single line of Korathi text. Sale translated it with a pause before and a pause after. The pauses, Elliot had learned over the last 2 days, were not hesitation. They were the breathing space she gave important things so they could be heard properly. The line read, "The air is verified. The vault will open. Do not come alone." Elliot considered this. He asked, in a tone he considered admirably measured, whether "do not come alone" was a warning, a protocol, or a threat. Sale said that her Korathi was precise, but that contextual emotional register in 8,000-year-old diplomatic cipher involved a margin of interpretive uncertainty she was not comfortable overstating. He thanked her for that answer. She said it was not an answer. He said it was the best kind. He asked if she would come with him. She said that she had spent 11 years arguing in published academic work that the Korathi chose to be found, and that if he told anyone the expression she was currently making, while agreeing to accompany him to a vault that proved she was right, she would deny this conversation entirely and cite equipment malfunction. The ring pulsed once, warm and even against his finger. Sale looked at it, then at him. That, she said firmly, was a coincidence. Elliot decided not to argue. The coordinates sat between them on the table, and the fabricator, unprompted, finally produced something that was almost the right temperature. The vessel they chartered was called the Meridian Ascent, which sounded dignified until one spent 11 days aboard it and understood that the name was aspirational. It smelled of the previous tenant's biochemistry work in a way that had thoroughly colonized the air recyclers. And the navigation AI, a mid-generation system with a vocabulary glitch that no one had apparently considered urgent enough to patch, described every spatial phenomenon it encountered using the word considerable. The gas cloud they passed on day 3 was considerable. The gravitational eddy near the Verkai transit hub was considerable. The silence between two people sitting across a small table with fold coordinates, and 11 years of contested academic theory between them was, according to no one but Elliot, also considerable. They talked. There was a great deal of time and not much else to do, and they were both people who thought better out loud when the alternative was thinking alone in a direction that led somewhere vertiginous. Sale told him things about the Korathi that had not made it into her published work. Not because they were speculative, she clarified, but because she had learned to front-load her arguments with what she could prove and keep what she believed in the room with her until the evidence arrived. Elliot told her about the excavation, about the tomb, which had been unremarkable by the standards of the site, a secondary burial chamber, partially collapsed, the kind of space that yielded fragments and context rather than objects of significance. About finding the ring in the 3rd week, in the corner of the chamber where the ceiling had come down, sitting in the dust as though it had been set there rather than buried. About putting it on because it fit, which he now recognized as the archaeological equivalent of pressing an unmarked button because it was there. Sale listened to this with an expression that moved between professional composure and something she was clearly working to keep professional. On the 6th day she told him, carefully, what she had been working toward saying since the consultation room. The theory was this. The Korathi, in the final decades before their withdrawal, had conducted a program of genetic seeding. Not randomly, deliberately, in a small number of populations on a young planet they had been observing for some time, a planet they considered promising in the way that patient civilizations consider potential promising, as something worth returning to. They had left markers, dormant, harmless, biologically invisible, until activated by the right proximity to Korathi technology. The ring had not accepted Elliot by accident or malfunction. It had recognized him because somewhere in the long, unbroken line of his ancestry was a thread placed there on purpose, 8,000 years ago, by people who had decided to trust the future with something important. Elliot sat with this for a long time. Then he said that this explained the genetic marker his family had always attributed to Eastern Mediterranean heritage, and that his mother was going to find this information either tremendously exciting or deeply inconvenient, depending on which day one told her. Sale said that in her experience, the truth was frequently both. The structure met them at the coordinates as though it had always known they were coming, which Elliot supposed it had. It was dark and enormous and entirely still in the way that only very old, very deliberate things are still, not inert, but patient, the stillness of something that had been waiting long enough that waiting had become its natural condition. When the ring grew hot against his finger, not painfully, but insistently, a pulse that quickened as the meridian ascent closed the distance, the navigation AI noted that the object ahead was, in its considered assessment, considerable. For once, Elliot agreed with it entirely. The outer surface responded to the ring's broadcast in sections, folding back in a sequence that Sale identified, in a voice she was keeping very steady, as a formal Korathi ceremonial welcome, the kind extended to returning members of the imperial house after long absence. It had last been used 8,000 years ago. It worked perfectly. Elliot found this either deeply moving or deeply unsettling and could not decide which, so he settled for both, which seemed honest. The innermost chamber was lit by a technology that had no business still functioning and was functioning anyway. Casting light in the amber frequency, the Korathi had favored for spaces of significance. The holographic emitter at the center of the room activated before they reached it, triggered by the ring, triggered by him, triggered by the very specific biological fact of his presence in this place at this time, which someone had arranged thousands of years before his grandmother's grandmother's grandmother was born. The figure that appeared spoke in Korathi. Sale translated quietly, close beside him, her voice low and even. The message said what it needed to say without ceremony, which surprised him. He had expected something grand and received instead something that felt, beneath the alien syntax, almost personal. It told him what the Korathi had been, a civilization that had reached the limit of what expansion could teach them, and had chosen, deliberately, to compress themselves rather than dilute themselves further, to withdraw, to preserve, to wait for the species they had seeded to grow into something that could inherit what they left. It told him why they had chosen Earth, and the reason was not strategic but something the translator rendered as affectionate regard, which Sale said was an imperfect translation, and probably the closest one available. It told him that the vault and everything within it, the libraries, the archives, the technical records of 47 civilizations absorbed and documented over 3,000 years of imperial history, was his to bring back. Not to own, to carry. When the hologram finished, the room was quiet. The light held steady. Elliot looked at the ring on his finger and thought about a Tuesday in Anatolia, about dust and collapsed ceiling, and the particular unremarkable nature of the moment in which one's life changes direction without announcing itself. He was not the same man who had sat in a grief chair 2 weeks ago and hoped the maintenance drone had enjoyed his presentation. Something had been added, or perhaps recognized, a weight that was not the ring's, that had always been there and had simply now been named. He did not feel imperial. He felt responsible, which seemed closer to correct. He looked at Sale. She was looking at the archive walls with the expression of someone who had argued for 11 years that a thing was real and had just been proven right so completely that rightness had briefly shorted out her ability to respond to it. He said that he supposed the peer reviewer who called her work, the cartography of a place no one is certain exists, owed her a letter. She said, without looking away from the walls, that she intended to frame it. The ring was warm and steady against his finger. Outside, the Meridian Ascent waited in the dark between stars, its navigation AI quietly finding everything considerable, and the vault held its breath around them, 8,000 years of waiting finally, gently, done.